So, within the disease, this is the union of opposites. Within the disease is the cure. Within the prison, the key to freedom. So, American values, or more traditional African values. Consumerism, that is being a hungry geist, that is a ghost that is basically gorging itself and is never satisfied, versus being content. Militarism, that is the ism of if you have a heartbeat, you are a target. Doesn't matter whether you're friendly or an enemy. You have a target, if you have a heartbeat, you're a target. So, strength through inner peace. Racism, human unity. So, certain types of American values, including consumerism, militarism, racism, are the prison. Within that prison, there's a key to freedom. Sometimes it's opposite. So sexism, heterosexism, an integral gender expression. That is to say, one that is neither sexist or heterosexist and or racist, classist, etc., etc. So 3 tests for Africans in America. So in Indian country, we actually looked at, in the Indian equivalent of the I am, there was a native elder who talked about there are 3 tests that were brought to Native American people, the Bible, in order of appearance, the Bible, the bottle, and the casino. First, the Bible is basically a Western Bible with basically the King James Version, etc., etc. Second, the bottle, that is alcohol. And third, casino. Now, many people think, oh, well, Native Americans, their fight is over, their struggle is over, they got casinos. Well, the profit that goes back to tribes for all Indian casinos in America is like $10 billion. $10 billion is nothing. Black people spend that in discretionary income. The discretionary income of black people is like $800 billion a year.
Say that again.
The discretionary income of black America. Okay, and this is a stat from the mid-aughts. That's the discretionary income. That is the money that you have to spend on stuff that ain't bills. The discretionary income of black America alone in the around 2005 would make black America by itself the 9th largest economy on the planet, behind California. Okay, 99. So that at the time was something like $800 billion with a B. What we're spending it on, okay, is clothes, cars, electronics,
Haircuts.
Haircuts, whatever. We're not spending it on books. We're not spending on education.
That's 120.
In fact, when that statistic was happening, basically black people spent less than $300 million a year on books. Now, I personally spent $4,000 on books, like to build this class, among other things. Right? So I was part of, most black people don't have libraries, personal libraries. Right? So here's the problem with that. And there's a book that's on your book list called Powernomics, written by a black economist. He points this out. Look, other communities circulate the dollars that they make, that they have as discretionary income 5 times within their community before it leaves their community. Okay, look at the Chinese, look at the Jews. 5 times. Black people, what we do and what we've been socialized to do, 99 cents out of every dollar goes out of the community and never returns. Okay? Because we haven't been taught to think of money as a form of wealth. We've taught, oh, well, you spend it, not invest it, not buy real estate, not stocks and bonds, not any of that stuff. All right? So, in terms of tests, all right? So the casino within Indian country teaches you an alien concept of money. That it's not sacred. That is not for you, it's not for the generations to come, it's for your personal consumption instead of building your community. Right? So that's 3 tests brought to natives. So, following that same idea, 3 tests for African Americans. So the tests, back to slide if you would, thank you. The tests are challenges to our ability to create a new reality out of nothing, and also our cultural to create a new reality out of nothing but our cultural capabilities to create free societies. Our ability to do that. So challenges to our ability to create a new reality out of nothing but our cultural capabilities to create free societies. So here's the test. Okay? Slavery has returned to America, not that it ever left. So now, basically in the form of addiction and what I call, 1, these are the 3 tests, the school to prison pipeline, the prison industrial complex, and the new Jim Crow. So the reason I started this in the 90s is because both of these trends, as they affect us in the 21st century, started definitely before the 80s, but definitely got established in the 80s. And they kind of creeped up on us. So, for example, when I talk about addiction, and I use the term, oh, this is some dangerous stuff. So, this is a made-up word. It's a made-up word because it doesn't exist in the dictionary, but I'm following the rules of grammar. So just like when I talk about in addiction, a hungry Geist literally means a hungry spirit. Okay, I made up that word using the rules of German because we get the English word hungry from German. Like poltergeist, noisy ghost, zeitgeist, spirit of the times, hungry geist. A spirit that takes over a person that causes them to consume and consume and consume and consume and not think about what they're doing. Just keep consuming and consuming and consuming without end. In Buddhism, they refer to it as a discarnate spirit that used to be a human, but now it's dead. Its body is dead, so it doesn't have a body, so it basically takes over people who are intoxicated and causes them to keep consuming and consuming and consuming till they die. So either alcohol or the drugs. So that's why I'm using it, or meth addicts or whatever. They're never satisfied. A hungry ghost is never satisfied either.
That's just a reflection of our own society consuming.
Right. Our society is based on hungry guys. So addiction is slavery. So just like slavery was supported by legal conventions, by laws and social practices, so is addiction. It's promoted just like slavery was. And it's legal. Major parts of the economy depend on it. All right? So, with black people, what I call, when you put the word auto before any word, it means whatever it is doing the action does it to itself. So the term auto-genocide, genocide is when you attempt to destroy or completely wipe out a people using military means most of the time. Attempt. Well, sometimes you actually do it, but, and sometimes you succeed, but most of the time you don't, because somebody stops you. The Rwandan genocide. the genocide that Hitler did with the Jews most classically. But even bigger than that, what happened to Native Americans by the North Americans that Hitler said he was inspired to do to the Jews because of the American example of the Native Americans. That's what he said inspired him to do that. America is an inspiration for a lot of shit. Okay? Inspired South Africa to do what it did with the homelands by segregation. Inspired Hitler. Hey, we are just a beacon of freedom.
Look what we did for colonialism.
Ah, yeah. Okay, so autogenocide. Here's how that works. You induce a people to destroy themselves. So understand, by using military force, by wiping out a people using military force, you take them out of the economic equation. They're dead. But if you can get them to kill themselves slowly, and you sell them the tools to do it, like alcohol and tobacco and drugs, you can make money while they're killing themselves. And they live to reproduce and then addict to other. Isn't that just
Like
amazing?
Florida in the early 80s.
Oh, Florida now with OxyContin. You don't even have to do the early 80s. So yeah, when we're talking about the whole cocaine epidemic,
Yeah.
autogenocide, okay?
But that would be considered autogenocide?
I would consider that autogenocide because remember, I made up the term to describe a phenomenon that I wasn't seeing described, but aptly describes what it is, right?
Are bath salts autogenocide?
Bath salts could be a form of autogenocide.
High fructose.
High fructose corn syrup.
Yeah, here.
Do you really want to go into that?
No.
When they smoke
No, it's okay if you do because it's an
I
interesting.
don't know what that is.
the bath salts, that was the thing on the East Coast in Florida where someone was like smoking bath salts, which is what people do apparently. And this guy ate this other dude's face.
Yeah, I read that.
Yeah, here.
Yeah.
They were
Real
smoking
story.
bath salts?
Yeah, they were
Apparently,
smoking.
that's what I
Okay, there. So one of the things that happened that I may or may not explained when we dealt with this topic earlier, which is why I don't mind bringing it up because it's a current issue, right? So part of what addiction depends on is you being sold on that this substance will do this for you without learning to do it for yourself without the substance. They don't teach you that, right? So the whole impulse to get high comes from the natural impulse to want to change your consciousness, particularly if you're in pain. You're in pain, you don't want to be in pain. You're impatient, you want to be patient. So if I just taught you how to do that, hey, breathe this way for 3 minutes. Then you don't need the joint. Or the
Basically
beer, or
like
whatever.
The same as like coffee, people that
Yeah.
drink coffee.
Yeah, I drink coffee, but
Unless it's decaf.
before you notice I'm on the edge without even drinking the coffee. So the coffee is just something to wet my whistle. I am a coffee addict. It has contributed to my speeding ticket habit. I speed under the influence of caffeine because I'm usually going a long way. But that's neither here nor there. Bath salts. Okay? So having been, a black addictions counselor for 40 years, I've seen certain things come and go. Right? There was a heroin epidemic, not that it's gone away, but there was a heroin epidemic at LCC that was experienced by students who were told by the dealers that they're selling them opium when they were actually selling them black tar heroin.
Right.
Now, these kids who were like 18 to 21 did not know what we, 49 to 50, almost 60-year-olds know. Real opium hasn't been on the street since the 60s or 70s, except for people from Southeast Asia who import it for the old folks that smoke it at home in, Southeast Asia. So
Not
we
easy
know,
to get.
yeah, so, that whole phenomenon of, okay, we're selling black tar heroin as opium, that's basically to addict a younger, less streetwise crowd.
Hippies.
Back in the day, in the early 80s, when the gangs like the Crips and the Bloods, etc., were selling PCP, angel dust, right? You saw effects like Armin described with people chewing off their face. PCP is a Dissociative anesthetic, that means it stops pain, but it has a psychedelic side effect. Sherms, right? Making supercools, etc. So if you are my friend, you smoke sherm, I smoke sherm, the drug makes me hallucinate and see you as a monster, pick up a kitchen knife, randomly stab you to death, and not remember it. Right? So because there's no pain, people then would take off their clothes, walk through plate glass windows, try and trash a store, and the police would try and subdue them, and they don't feel pain, so it was easier for LAPD just to shoot dust heads than try and subdue them, because you hit them over the head with something, they don't feel it, because of the effect of the drug, they're in a whole other reality, right? So, the reason I went off on this whole thing about bath salts, okay, those effects sound like dust to me, right? And so is it a new thing or just an old thing that they brought back? Repackaged, right? Because, theoretically, if it's bath salts and it is chemically resembling something you would put in water in a bath, right? But nobody's using like that, they're smoking it, and it's producing these wild effects. Well, Wikipedia, not that I trust that as a source, but it offered an alternative, the idea that they're cannabinoids, that is, there's like 420 plus chemicals that are specific to cannabis, that THC is one of them, CBD is another one of them, THZ is another one. These are the ones that the plant is cultivated for, but there's others that are rarer within the plant that are usually insignificant at the levels that people smoke or eat them at. But if you separate those chemicals out, because the ones that are going to be illegal are THC, THZ, CBD. These other chemicals, nobody knows about. So you take those, you concentrate them, it's bath salts, get people to smoke them, they produce effects that are wildly different than the other chemicals, and so you're starting to see other things. So that's the working theory that I saw on Wikipedia, which, okay, so let's test that out. But they're not going to test that out.
It's legal too, you can sell them on the internet.
And it's legal, right, because they haven't made it illegal yet. But they might catch up to it. All this to say, you have to prepare yourself with information to watch out for these trends. Because America is the kind of place where they would develop bath salts to have you mess up your mind.
Stay away from pills and powders.
Well, not just them, but hey. All right, so back to addiction, right? And autogenocide. So the school to prison pipeline, prison industrial complex, and the new Jim Crow. So starting with the first one, school to prison pipeline. When you defund the schools and don't provide certain core educational functions to improve intelligence, that is, libraries and reading, music is not a cultural piece, it actually helps you with other forms of learning by patterning your brain to take in information in particular ways. The discipline of learning a musical instrument patterns your brain to do other things besides music. That's why it's so integral within African culture. Drums, mbiras, singing, all that stuff is not just cultural expression, it's developing your mental capacities. That's why it was in schools. So I'm old enough to remember when music lessons, orchestras were all part of the schools. When libraries had librarians. And you were encouraged not only to go to your school library to check out books, you had books for sale. And you had your own library card for the public libraries. Remember those? Okay, so these things are improving intelligence. Libraries, music, physical ed. Okay, because a growing body and brain need physical activity to support each other. When you start taking out physical education, when you stop having libraries with librarians, when you stop having music, Okay? You are making the school worse. And basically, then schools become warehouses for those who survive testing rather than educating.
Survive.
Okay? So this is deliberate because the net effect is if you have a population that cannot generate its own knowledge, you can control them by limiting the knowledge. That's why the net's so powerful. Because people have the illusion that it knows everything. Because you can just, oh, I can Google this and I can find, okay, well, what's in Google? Google tar baby. Okay? Because black people know tar baby is an ethnic slur like nigger. But Google doesn't recognize, Wikipedia doesn't recognize tar baby as an ethnic slur. Except that it quotes the New Republic, which is a right-wing magazine. Why are you using racist as a source for whether racists use an ethnic slur? Why don't you use the target? So obviously Wikipedia ain't, one, neither culturally competent nor, populated with enough black folks to correct obvious stupidity. It's not a West African trickster tale. It's nigger. That's how we know it. So stop using it in therapy with black clients. Oh, it's just a metaphor. Really? Educating.
Excuse me.
Yes.
So when you talk of testing rather than educating, for example, like in Africa, when countries like England, France, Italy, when they came and they colonized, what they did was they brought in the education system from their countries, and the people within Africa sort of were never given a chance to be educated and to be able to know what Africa is all about, or because Africa had its own education before they came.
Right.
But I'm just realizing from what you're saying that it was actually a way of colonizing the people more and more, because you took away the education that they're supposed to have and you brought your own. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes.
Bringing
Let me rephrase it like this. Okay?
Yeah.
Once you colonize somebody, Fanon talked about this, the African psychiatrist, said what colonization is not simply about taking over a country militarily and mining it for resources. One of the things it also does is it colonizes your mind to support that exploitation as normal.
Like the Manchurian candidate.
Sure, the Manchurian candidate is one way of doing it, but basically saying, okay, in the ABCs of colonization. So first of all, ABCs, right? So you learn the Latin alphabet, you learn a European language, but you don't know about African alphabets and African languages, even though you're in Africa. So the colonials make you forget all your history and say, okay, this is what you need to know to service us. This is like the Borg in Star Trek. We will, your cultural diversity will be utilized to serve us. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile. Right? So that's what the educational system does. So what about America then? Okay, so the education that my kids and my grandkids are getting is different from the one that I was raised on. When we had music classes, Chuck D, when he came here a couple of years ago, talked about this. He said, look, the reason that hip-hop is playing turntables is because music classes were destroyed in public schools. So that the only thing that you were left with was a turntable and records. So you began thinking of the turntable as an instrument, and then computers came along, and then you could sample a sound, or you could you could have a drum machine, but you didn't know what a 6/8 rhythm was. You didn't know what a key signature was. You didn't know how to play a horn line because you didn't get music lessons in school. You know, my first instrument was trumpet. I learned to play the trumpet, and piano. And then the Beatles hit the 6th grade, and then, you know, all the girls were, you know, oh, you're a guitar player. And then Jimi Hendrix and, you know, the blues, et cetera, guitar players. Classical, you know, my guitar teacher was a black man who said, okay, you need to learn the Moors. Classical guitar. It's from the Moors. This is black Africans playing this music. This is the history of this tuning, and there's that tuning, right? So, but that education is fast disappearing, or if it exists at all, it's in rich white schools. If it exists at all, right? So testing rather than educating, and then educating to the test. Students get into addiction at an early age. In the state of Oregon, we know the first use of people using is 10 years old, which is basically the 5th grade. Okay? And if they are of color, their addiction goes untreated. We definitely see that in the state of Oregon, and there's no reason to indicate that that is not being reflected nationally.
Well, you're lucky they didn't give you Ritalin, that's for sure.
Well, there's that
That's a
too.
case.
Okay? So the connection between addiction and education. The schools are not armed camps, even though they have police officers in there, but the police officers aren't able to stop the effects of the underground economy of the drug trade getting into schools so people can get addicted. Once they get addicted, you design schools to produce profit. Okay, so we're just educating for the test, we're educating to produce workers, not educating to create freedom fighters or social activists or civil rights folks.
Do you know what the fastest growing industry in the U.S. is?
I'm about to get to it.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Okay, so when you talk about designing schools to produce profit, profit for who? So, for example, private prison beds are based on the number of 4th grade black and Hispanic boys reading below grade level in America. Okay? So if they know that a certain amount of kids of color, primarily black and Hispanic. So when we talk about, Fanon would call this sociostructural violence. Okay? So we know that a prison population is largely illiterate. So why are they illiterate? Why aren't they taught to read? Part of the problem, and I'm saying this as an educator, growing up by slaves who taught themselves to read when it was a death sentence, we never trusted the mainstream schools to educate us. We always made sure we had our education before we got to school. So if we got tested, we already knew it, and then we could go and do other stuff. Because the school was only going to teach to the test. So we made sure that we knew the test and we could ace the test, but we knew more than what was on the test. But here's the problem. What if people don't have the ability or don't choose to educate their children before their kids get to school? What if they're depending on the school to educate them? Well, the schools weren't designed to do social service. The schools weren't designed to deal with kids who weren't ready to learn, i.e., they had stable homes. I mean, in order to really benefit from the form of education they're talking about, you have to have a stable home, you have to be food secure, you have to be safe and fed by the time that you get to school. And then ready to learn by already having your ABCs and being able to count and do numbers before kindergarten. If you don't have that, if you're depending on the school to teach you, and there's 30 kids in the classroom, and some of them are acting up, and some of them are on Ritalin, and some of them have witnessed violence at home, and they ain't gonna sit down. So then it becomes a classroom management issue and becomes like a warehouse to keep kids off the street, assuming, they're not loaded and all that other kind of stuff too. Teachers weren't trained to do social service work. They weren't trained to be counselors. They weren't trained to be crisis counselors. They were just taught to educate. So what happens when people bring their social problems to school? And you don't supply the schools with the people who are trained to deal with it, like me. That's why I was a drug counselor in the high school in Eugene, coming out of a program that was in New York and Jersey, where you have full-time drug counselors because there's social problems in the classroom. So you have to, have somebody for them to talk to. So, back to slide. Private prison beds built based on the number of 4th grade Black and Hispanic boys reading below grade level. So why is that? So for example, if you don't know the alphabet song, you don't read. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Okay, you don't know your alphabet, you don't read. You don't learn how to sound out letters, you don't read. Can't read, you can't write. Can't write? What if it's based on reading? The curriculum. Then what? So what happens is, if you don't read at grade level by 4th grade, that's a known number. They take that number and project out that population is going to go to prison. And they build prisons based on that number because they can be assured that if you're not reading, here's what'll happen, right? So again, if you depend on the schools alone for your education, you might not make it. So therefore, if you drop out by 8th or 10th grade and are not working a legal trade which will lead to steady, dependable income, you'll turn to the underground economy for income. You'll get busted because they'll target you. And that's how they can build prison beds, based on that number. Wish I was making this up. Okay? But when we're talking about the school to prison pipeline and this being a major issue in terms of the Black community, well, we had the structures to stop this. We have them. We could recreate them. This is why for kids going to school hungry, this is why the Panthers had a free breakfast program. This is why they had tutoring outside of schools, because the schools couldn't do it, because they were being defunded. Some might say deliberately. Okay, not only is an addicted population a controlled population, but an ignorant population is also a controlled population.
So
Yeah.
who's doing this?
The who almost doesn't matter. It just suffice to say that it is being done.
Well, the reason why I'm asking is, we're learning so that we can find a solution to some of the issues that
Right,
we have. And
right.
so, if we have an understanding as to,
Big brother?
The dominant parent.
Well, again, who is Big Brother? Okay? So part of the piece, look, Obama was able to go to Harvard. People that go to Harvard set policy for the country, if not the world, even though he came from poor beginnings. All right? So his Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, is a big proponent of teaching to test basically a corporate model of school. Not the Little Red Schoolhouse to the degree that, or certainly not a liberation school, which is basically the first public schools in America were run by Black people and were open to everybody.
Harvard has one of the worst racist policies in the history of this country.
Yes, and Harvard is an elite school. So elite and racist seem to kind of go together in a certain sense. So the who doesn't matter as much as what can be done about it and who takes the power to do something about it, right? So if you drop out, and this is part of where the whole school to prison pipeline, if you are not properly educated and or you do not take it upon yourself to educate yourself, beyond the level that's set by public education, then you can be subject to the school and prison pipeline because you won't know about other options. Right? So part of that school to prison pipeline, and this is just, I don't have access to the Oregon stats, but this is the California stats, and California sets the educational tempo for the country because it's California and Texas that produces the school textbooks. Right? So who are the prisoners? This is California. So 70% of the prison inmates in the United States are illiterate, either not reading or not reading at grade level. 200,000 inmates suffer from a serious mental illness. Okay, PTSD, certainly in prison, or other mental illness, bipolar, whatever, schizophrenia. 60 to 80% has a history of substance abuse, while the number of drug treatment slots in American prisons has declined by more than half since '93. And 80% of prisoners in California are African Americans, while which obviously, so if that is 8 times the percentage in the population or more, there is something that's producing that. That's, again, socio-structural violence. Okay, so these things are interrelated. They're being set up in school to become prisoners. Because then when you privatize the prisons, which is like somewhere in the next slide, people make money.
80% of the prisoners in California are African Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Yes.
I know. So I think this is why the education system because if you really learn what the problems are at an early age, because people are going to school, but it's just a formality. You go to school, but you're not getting education to help you learn and realize what life is all about. So the whole thing is worked up because.
Well, I don't give you problems without a solution. So you notice this isn't in your book, assuming you've been reading the books. Okay, but this is a current problem in terms of looking at, okay, noticing that this is one of the problems that's going to be persistently with us. How do we prevent it here? Starting here. Assuming I'm recruiting you to be activists to do that. Just an assumption, right? So let's start with the reality, right? So for example, last year, and I think this is like 2 or 3 years ago, Cali sent 140,000 people to prison, released 132,000. On average, inmates spend 2.5 years behind bars and serve a term of 2 to 3 years on parole. 2/3 of them are parole violators in prison. So California has an overcrowded prison system, even though it's probably one of the largest, and this is contributing to the fact that the United States has, the land of the free has 2 million people incarcerated and an additional 5 million under the control of parole and probation. Largest of any country in the world, more than many countries combined. So if we put this in a local framework, okay, so there's mainstream schools, there's alternative schools, there's juvenile corrections, there's kids in foster care, adult corrections, parole probation, the 2-year community college and the 4-year college and graduate school. So we could basically tell this story here. Doing what I do, I personally know black kids that I met in high school when I was a high school drug counselor, like the only black kid in a car full of white kids that was smoking weed. They were all smoking weed. They all get pot tickets, but the white kids get treatment, the black kid got jail. In Cebu. With a drug conviction, got no drug treatment. While the white kids got drug treatment. So it is a medical fact. If an addiction will continue if you don't treat it. Right? So back in the 90s, which is the time period we're considering, basically one of the things we found is when we asked them for disaggregated data, that is disaggregated by race, have whites separated, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Latinos, Native Americans, how many are in your system? Are they in the system disproportionately according to by race? Yes, they are. Okay, so let's segregate it out by drug offenses. Who's getting treatment? White kids would get treatment first or second offense. All the kids of color got no treatment, even with 9 or 7 or whatever offenses. Untreated in juvenile corrections means it's a free fall into the adult system. And so I met one of those statistics, who I met while I was a drug counselor at Churchill, and then when I came to Lane Community College, came here 6 years later, and the first drug treatment that he got in his life was seeing me. Because Serbu didn't treat him. And he got no treatment in adult corrections in the Oregon system, even though all he had was drug offenses and an untreated addiction. Okay, so people make money from those consequences. Right? So same thing happens in foster care, adult corrections, and then, if he's coming to a 2-year school, to further his education, he basically has to follow the straight and narrow, and if he doesn't, it's back to prison, which kind of plays hell on your financial aid, depending on if you get a conviction, and you can't get financial aid because now, and this is the part of that's the new Jim Crow, right? The prison industrial complex. Okay, so even though the rate of violent crime has fallen, prison incarceration has grown, and then it's been farmed out to private industry, which basically, as a profiteering enterprise, has a vested interest in increasing and maintaining its prison population.
Growth industry.
It's a growth industry. Is that what you were referring to as the largest growth
Yes,
industry?
it is.
Yes, right.
Statistically, it's the largest, fastest growing industry in the U.S.
Right. So increasing because it basically is imprisoning people who committed nonviolent offenses, usually drug offenses. Right? So politicians, both liberal and conservative, use the fear of crime to gain votes. Impoverished rural areas, like, for example, Junction City, or wherever, prisons have become a cornerstone of economic development. Private companies tap into $35 billion a year in spending on prisons in the country. So as an example, private prisons keep 90,000 prisoners from 27 states. Bed brokers rent cell facilities $20 to $60 a day with $2 to $5 commission per man day, per person per day. Trucking prisoners hundreds of miles through the country, as the prisoners refer to it as diesel therapy. Okay, if they deem you a troublemaker, they ship you off to somewhere else where you have to readjust to somewhere else. For example, payphone. One payphone in prison generates $15,000 a year, and there are also phone services that charge you $10 a minute to speak to your prisoner that you have to pay for. So it's a growth industry, the prison industrial complex. So, The New Jim Crow, by Michelle Alexander. Today, says Alexander, this is a book, The New Jim Crow, basically it talks about the prison industrial complex. A criminal freed from prison has scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a freed slave or a black person living free in Mississippi at the height of Jim Crow. More African...
One more time?
Yep.
That's crazy.
Has scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a freed slave or a black person living free in Mississippi in the height of Jim Crow. More African Americans are under control of the criminal justice system today in prison or in jail on probation or parole than were enslaved in 1850. You did see what I was talking about in the prison industrial complex, and you saw the numbers, and that was just California. Project that out. Okay? So think about it. I mean, yeah, it was shocking to me too, but I've gotten used to it and I'm more pissed off. Only because, okay, this is a waste.
Can't build more prisons and make more money if they're not full
Right.
over.
Okay? So we may have 2 million people behind bars, but there's another 5 million under control, parole, and probation at any given time. All right? So that's 7 million people. Now, what happens, and this is what Michelle is talking about, because she didn't believe the statistic as a lawyer, black woman lawyer, right? Here's what happens. Discrimination in housing, education, employment, and voting rights, which many Americans thought was wiped out by the civil rights laws of the 1960s, now perfectly legal against anyone liable to felons. And who are these felons?
No.
Mostly are non-violent drug offenses. Even though, again, this is another case of sociostructural violence, even though the majority of illegal drug users continue to be white people who make in excess of $50,000, these are not the people going to prison. The black people are the ones selling to them and going to prison because they see that as an option to working at Mickey D's, which, yeah, I'm sure. Slinging dope definitely makes you more money than minimum wage. But it means that you sacrifice certain other choices. They catch you, which, since they're targeting you, don't give them more things to target. Many more people of color than whites are made felons by the entire system of mass incarceration. Racial discrimination remains as powerful as it was under slavery or under the post-slavery era of Jim Crow segregation. So what she's saying is, look, race discrimination didn't end. It shifted. It adapted. Same game, new name, different rules. You're targeted if you have an excellent sundan, if you can't pass the paper bag test. Okay, if you don't use your intelligence to avoid the targeting. Just understand you're targeted, that's all.
And anyone being targeted like that, dealing with the specialist invisible stuff, they often look for an escape route.
Mm-hmm.
To like deal with all the emotional stuff, and that's where the addiction comes in. It just plays right into it.
Yeah. So basically she's saying, in her book, The New Jim Crow, with mass incarceration in the age of colorblindness. So colorblindness is a form of racism, okay? She says there's a racial caste system. So she defines racial caste as a racial group locked into an inferior position by law and custom. Jim Crow and slavery were caste systems. Our current system of mass incarceration is also a caste system, so i.e. the new Jim Crow. So the original Jim Crow laws after slavery ended promoted racial discrimination in public housing, employment, voting, and education. The civil rights struggles ended that, except for they got reinstated under this whole war on drugs thing. She pointed out. New system of racial control targeting black men through the war on drugs. So, for example, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 under Reagan and Bush included far more severe punishment for distribution of ounces of crack, got you 10 years or more, than pounds of powder cocaine, which got you 5 years or less. Now, if you do the math, And if you understand how crack is made, which is more dangerous, an ounce of crack, or a pound of cocaine that can be used to make, I can give you the expansion, but again, 28 grams to an ounce. A gram, I mean, if you wanted to do the math, if you have a handy calculator.
454
Okay, 454?
is how many grams in a pound?
Well, right, no. Okay, so each gram can make 10 rocks. 28 grams
It's 1 ounce.
to an ounce. It's 280 rocks. Times 16, half a pound. Okay, all you need to make crack with regular cocaine is baking soda and water.
Another feature is that that's federal time, which is.
Right, and that's federal time. So notice, okay, possession of an ounce of crack gets you more time than a half a pound of cocaine. Where's the logic in that? The half a pound of cocaine is more dangerous
And if you have
to
powder-
society.
If you get busted with powder, you're gonna go to a state pen instead of federal, and it's only half the time.
Yeah, yeah, so,
Apparently Obama just changed that to like, it's instead of 10 times as serious, it's 3 times.
okay, well,
But which is still a joke, which is still a joke.
thanks, Bombster.
Yeah, right.
All right, so civil penalties such as not being able to live in public housing, not being able to get student loans have been added to the already harsh prison sentences. All right, so she basically says that nothing short of a major social movement can end the new caste system. She basically says establish grassroots movement to deal with the foundation of mass incarceration. The movement that emerges to end mass incarceration does not meaningfully address the racial divisions and resentments that gave rise to mass incarceration, and if it fails to cultivate an ethic of genuine care, compassion, and concern for every human being of every class, race, and nationality within our nation's borders, including poor whites who are often pitted against poor people of color, the collapse of mass incarceration will not mean the death of racial caste in America, which probably means it'll be recast in another form. Inevitably, a new systemized system of racialized social control would emerge. No task is more urgent for racial justice today than ensuring that America's current racial caste system is its last. So, basically a large social movement of educated and skilled people needs to be created outside of and inside of the educational system. Yes.
And so when you say a large social movement needs to be created, and who's going to create them? I mean, I guess, yeah, who's going to create that social movement?
Who? Never depend on the system to do for you what you should be doing for yourself. Because they won't.
Yeah.
Okay? So I was able, NAACP asked me and some others to participate in a panel last Friday, which was basically looking at racial profiling in the state of Oregon, and also basically a conversation about racism in general. So, well, you know me, so basically I talked about, the 6 isms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, attending that meeting were people from the Department of Youth Services and the Chief of Police, because the conversation is like juvenile justice, adult corrections, and law enforcement in terms of racial profiling. All right, so a number of people have been racially profiled. So even when you have college professors at the U of O who've left the community because they got multiply racially profiled by the Eugene police, when you could talk about, these are things that I didn't necessarily talk about that night, because I was given 10 minutes and is enough to get through the 6 isms, and hey, this is part of social structural violence. What you need to do is build your skill so that you know what's going on. But after what I didn't say, and thought about saying, but I'll say it now because now it's appropriate because it answers your question. After 20 years of attempting to work with both the juvenile justice system and the police department in terms of doing diversity training, et cetera, I'm saying, no, the community needs to train itself. Because these institutions are not going to change. They don't have a vested interest in changing. Even if they have, say, a police chief or certain officers that are willing to be on the right page in terms of training. Okay? The systems themselves, like juvenile justice, was based on slavery. It came out of slavery. Until they address those root causes, they're going to continue to replicate slavery. All right? Within their system. I just described what happened locally. Okay. Black kids who in need of drug treatment, they were diagnosed with drug problems, got no drug treatment while incarcerated in your system. None. Zero. Why? We don't know. Okay. Why aren't you applying the medical criteria? It's very simple. The color of their skin determines medical treatment? Oh, you're being provocative. No. Okay, so what you're saying then is even after all this training, I can't trust you to do the medically appropriate thing. All right, so I'm not going to trust you at all. And after 20 years of continually trying to work, okay, I'm done. The community needs to be made stronger, made aware, and meet its own needs. Okay, so
we basically need leaders. Like, I feel like now
but just like in the rebellion, because we got less than a minute, you need to understand any leader that becomes visible becomes a target. So we need to create invisible leaders that are able to use their power and influence without being incarcerated and without being targeted by the system. And have to be personally excellent. So that's where we go. And I will leave the rest of the lecture up. And then we'll talk about it in the final 2 days.
You don't stop that.
Yes.
That person is for me, because I have so much ever.
You can roll music if you wish.
You know him.
Yeah.
Yeah,
He was one of the people at the conference.
He really pulled himself. That's why I guess he just had an hour to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. He